Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They're entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Alive presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It's an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we'll change the format a little bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give you a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the end of the screen at the end of the program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio Ward Hill Lamon.
My name is Ward Hill Lamon, spelled L-A-M-O-N. I was born January the 6th, 1828, in Mill Creek, Virginia. At age 2, my family and I moved about 10 miles west to a little town called Mill Creek, Virginia, which is just south of Martinsburg, Virginia. It was at Mill Creek where I went to school, learned how to ride my horse, shoot my gun, and my grandfather taught me how to play the banjo. At age 18, I moved to Danville, Illinois at the insistence of my cousin Theodore Lamon. He and his 2 brothers lived in Danville. He was a medical doctor. I studied for a short time under Dr. Theodore, but decided quickly that it probably wasn't a good idea to be a doctor in Danville. They had already a lot of doctors. So I decided instead to become an attorney. You see, Danville was the county seat of Vermilion County, and that's where all the action of the court took place. So I read law, and I attended some classes at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. Became an attorney. My assignment was the 8th Circuit Court of Illinois. Now, the 8th Circuit Court of Illinois is the largest circuit court in the United States, covering 14 counties. The attorneys and the judge went by buggy and by horseback around those 14 counties. It took us 6 months to complete 1 circuit. We did 2 circuits each year. It was on that assignment that I met the most prominent attorney in Illinois. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln and I became fast friends, not because we were alike, because we were very different. Where he was sad, I'm very gregarious. Where he didn't smoke, I smoked 15 cigars a day. Mr. Lincoln did not drink. I drink whiskey by the pitcher. He was very quiet. I am very loud. And where they called him Honest Abe, they never once called me Honest Hill, if you know what I mean. In 1850, I was invited to a party at the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois. It was there I met Mrs. Lincoln for the first time. Oh, I'd heard lots about her, that she was a witch in a dress, and that she threw plates at Mr. Lincoln when she was angry at him. She told me that Mr. Lincoln was very fond of me, and she asked me if I knew why she married Mr. Lincoln. I said no, I had no idea. She said it was because he was going to be president of the United States someday. In 1850, I found that rather outrageous. In 1852, Mr. Lincoln asked me to become his law partner. It was my job to bring in clients, to take care of the business of the office, and to research the law cases, and his job to defend them in court. In our 4-year partnership, we defended 114 cases in the Vermilion County Courthouse in Danville, winning most of them. Our partnership dissolved in 1856, not because there was any disagreement, because there wasn't, but because I was elected the prosecuting attorney for the circuit court. In 1860, I was appointed to a committee to go to the National Republican Convention at the Wigwam Building in Chicago, Illinois. Our job there was to try to convince the delegates to switch their vote to Mr. Lincoln if there was no winner on the first ballot. As luck would have it, there was no winner on the first ballot. The second ballot was to be conducted the second day. That evening, the delegates went to the play Our American Cousins at the McVicker Theater, but I had more important things to do. I met with the man who printed the tickets to the wigwam and gave him a large bundle of cash where he would secretly print extra tickets. When the delegates the next morning supporting other candidates came into the wigwam was already filled with supporters of our candidate, Abraham Lincoln, and they were not able to enter. The fire marshal closed the building. Now, Mr. Lincoln won on the fourth ballot and became the Republican nomination for president. He ran against 3 other candidates in the fall for the presidency of the United States. Even though the other 3 candidates got more votes than Mr. Lincoln was elected because he had more than any other individual candidate, and he was elected president with less than 40% of the vote. Now, Mr. Lincoln decided that he would ask me to go with him to Washington, which I agreed to go. He said if things got tough in Washington, he needed me to be there. And so he decided that we would take a train trip to Washington so that the people who voted for him would be allowed to see him on the way. And so the train stopped in various places, including in Indianapolis, Indiana, where the Illinois delegation was getting ready to go back home. They caught me before they left and surrounded me, and Jesse Du Bois, who was their leader, shook his finger in my face and said, "We entrust the sacred life of Mr. Lincoln for your protection. If you fail to take care of him, never return to Illinois, for we will murder you." Well, I laughed. I thought that was pretty funny. But I looked around, nobody was laughing. At that point, I unofficially became the personal bodyguard of Abraham Lincoln. My job started on that trip. A detective, Alan Pinkerton, came on board the train, told Mr. Lincoln there was a plot to assassinate him when the train passed through through Baltimore. The Baltimore secessionists had vowed to kill Mr. Lincoln before he was allowed to take his oath of office. Mr. Pinkerton said that he had a plan to take Mr. Lincoln through Baltimore safely, but Mr. Lincoln didn't trust Mr. Pinkerton. Neither did I. So I devised a plan to allow Mr. Lincoln to go through Baltimore safely in the middle of the night, and I had him in Washington the next day when his train was supposed to be in Baltimore. He was already safely in Washington. In Washington, my official job became the U.S. Federal Marshal of the District of Columbia. This is the badge of the Federal Marshal's office. It was my job to take care of all of the feeding of all the prisoners, to transport them back and forth to their court appearances, and to take care of the jails in the District of Columbia. In 1863, I was asked to be the marshal in charge of the dedication of the National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There I was in charge of security. I was in charge of requesting delegates from the northern states to attend. I borrowed the buggies and the horses for the dignitaries to ride. I set up the procession, and then I was master of ceremonies on the stage. I was the one who introduced Mr. Lincoln for his short remarks, which later were called his Gettysburg Address. And Mr. Lincoln didn't think his address was very successful. In fact, he said to me, "Hill, that speech won't sour. It is a failure. People are disappointed." However, Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours at that event, said to Mr. Lincoln that he supported what his talk was about. In fact, Mr. Everett said, "I would be glad to trade my 100 pages for your 20 lines." When the war ended on April the 9th, 1865, Washington rejoiced. That was on Palm Sunday. 2 days later, on April the 11th, Mr. Lincoln gave me a pass and requested that I go to Richmond, Virginia to meet with officials there to help bring the country back together. I told Mr. Lincoln that I should not go, that Washington was still a dangerous place. Mr. Lincoln, as usual, laughed because he didn't think he needed a bodyguard in the first place. Realizing that he was pretty adamant that I go, I asked him to stay in the White House while I was gone, and I also requested that he not go to the theater. As you may know, Mr. Lincoln didn't take my advice. In fact, very often he asked for advice but didn't take it. He and his wife went to the play Our American Cousins at Ford's Theater on Good Friday, April 14th. Metropolitan Police Officer John Parker was set to guard them. Mr. Parker moved his chair to watch the play when they got safely in the box. John Wilkes Booth came up the back stairs and shot Mr. Lincoln. If I'd have been there, Mr. Booth would have died. Mr. Booth only had a 4-inch gun and 1 bullet and a knife. He wasn't going to shoot me with the bullet because then he wouldn't have had anything for Abraham Lincoln. So what I would have done, I would have shot him with both of my Colt 44 pistols. I would have stabbed him with both my Bowie knives. I would have hit him with my brass knuckles. I would have hit him with my blackjack. I would have stabbed him with the 8-inch sword that I have in my cane. And then I would have kicked him to see if he were indeed dead. That's just the kind of guy I am. But I was not there. And I've regretted that my entire life. Mr. Lincoln died the next day. When I returned to Washington, I had the dubious job of taking care of the funeral arrangements for the Lincoln funeral in the White House. Mrs. Lincoln did not attend. And then I had to take care of his body as he went back to Springfield, Illinois to be buried. Along the way, that funeral train followed the same path that the train had followed from Springfield to Washington in reverse order. And hundreds of thousands of people passed by the open casket in mourning of their fallen president. When we arrived in Springfield, Illinois, I buried my friend, Abraham Lincoln.
I'm here with Mr. Wardhill Lamon, certainly known as President Abraham Lincoln's personal bodyguard. I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us today, Mr. Lamon.
Thank you.
I was listening to your earlier monologue, and I just wanted to ask you a few questions. And I know that you took quite personally and professionally, I guess, and hard the death of Mr. Lincoln when you had been assigned out of town, and the president, against your advice and wishes, went out. I would just like to ask you, I know, how did you find out about his death, or at least him being shot, and what sort of evolved after you found out?
Well, I got a telegram when I was in Richmond in the middle of the night saying that he was shot, and then shortly after his death, got another telegram and was asked to come back to Washington. So I went back to Washington on Saturday, the same day that he died, and started making preparations for the funeral right away. It was pretty complicated because the funeral was held in the White House, and then his body was to lay in state in the Capitol, and then we were to follow the train that had brought him to Washington. We were to follow that same schedule, and each major city was going to have some, big event, and his body was going to be on public display there, so that the mourners could see him. But yeah, it was a personal tragedy to me. He was my best friend.
So how can you remember how long that trip took? Because you organized all or most of that, did you not, in terms of getting him from D.C. back to
Yeah,
Illinois?
it was pretty complicated because like New York City, there were literally millions of people that wanted to see him, so each city wanted more hours of him being on display, so to speak, and so it took I don't recall exactly 10 or 11 days to get back to Springfield.
Wow. So and were you? I guess you were. Did you make the trip as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was there the whole time.
Yeah. So after the president was laid to rest, what did you do? I mean, did you remain as marshal in?
I was asked to be on President Johnson's cabinet, which I refused. I knew that his leanings were different than Mr. Lincoln, and I worried about what was going to happen. I practiced law in Washington. I also bought William Herndon's papers. William Herndon was another of Lincoln's law partners, and hired Jeremiah Black to write a book called The Life of Abraham Lincoln from his birth to his inauguration as president, and that was published in 1872.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you mentioned, you were a good friend of the president and Mr. Lincoln. Do you have any stories that you'd like to relate to us about Mr.
Sure,
Lincoln
I'd be happy to.
People find interesting?
He was very uneducated formally. He went to school for less than a year, but he was one of the smartest men I knew. An example of that was that before I met him, he told me of action that took place. He criticized the treasurer of the state of Illinois, James Shield, in a letter to the editor, and Mr. Shields challenged him to a duel. And Mr. Lincoln, because he was challenged, got to pick the weapon. Now, Mr. Shields was a crack shot with a pistol, which is the customary dueling weapon, so he decided he didn't want to do that. So he chose broadswords. And these are these big, huge swords that you have to use both hands. He actually hired a personal trainer to teach him how to do it. And Mr. Shields, hearing what the weapon would be, and knowing that Mr. Lincoln was very powerful, very strong, and had very long arms, I guess.
Probably better reach than
probably decided that he was going to lose his head in the duel. Decided that he would cancel the duel. So that's a explanation of how smart Mr. Lincoln was. He also talked in riddles and had a very interesting sense of humor. Somebody asked him at the White House, challenged him and said that he was two-faced, and Mr. Lincoln said, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd wear this one?"
Well, Mr. Hill, you and I are brothers in one respect, in as much as we both play banjo, and so. Did Mr. Lincoln enjoy the banjo? Or did you
absolutely.
Play for him,
he all the time was on me to sing silly little songs for him at the banjo. It was one of the only times I've ever seen the president smile, was when I was playing the banjo for him. So, yeah.
And you also mentioned in your talk that on the trip from Illinois to D.C. at the beginning of his presidency, that Pinkerton, Alan Pinkerton, tried to warn you of this assassination plot, but that you guys didn't really trust him. Why didn't you trust Mr. Pinkerton?
Well, he was pretty much unknown at the time. He just kind of showed up. We didn't know what his background was or anything.
Yeah.
No, he actually later when we checked out the information, his information was pretty good. In fact, we got it from another source at the same time. So, but at the time, we didn't know who he was, so we weren't going to take his word for it. But in fairness, I was in charge of security. I wasn't going to pretend that we weren't told and take the consequences. I was going to make sure that we got through safely. And if it was an embarrassment to Mr. Lincoln, I'm sorry, he was safe. Mm-hmm. That's all I was worried about.
Right. Well, at this time, I'd like to point out that this isn't really Ward Hill Lemon. This is actually Mr. Bob O'Connor from Charlestown.
Right.
And Bob is one of our newer, I guess, History Live characters, although you've been portraying Mr. Lemon for
6 or 7 years.
Yeah, for
Right.
quite a while. So I'm going to ask you what I ask everybody that does this
Okay.
for us is, what was it about Mr. Lemon that interested you to the point that you felt that you wanted to research him?
Well, he's a local guy for me because he was born right outside of Charlestown, lived right out of Charlestown, and is buried there. Not too many people in my area knew about him. I started doing research in Danville, Illinois, where he lived, and they didn't know much about him either. And then in looking at the all the Lincoln books, there would be half a sentence about him. He was Lincoln's bodyguard. You know, that would be it. Mm-hmm. Nobody had ever written a book about him. Nobody had ever really studied about him. I actually wrote a historical novel about him called The Virginian Who Might Have Saved Lincoln. And after I researched that, I went to the Huntington Library in California to try to find out some more information about him. And I found 3,000 letters in their research files at the Huntington Library. And I also found another book which he wrote called The Life of Abraham Lincoln as President. It's never been published, and I bought the rights to publish that, and that was published for the first time in 2010.
Do you know when he wrote that, or
He wrote it in the 1880s at the urging of some of the people that he knew that said that, you know, it'd be a shame that the information would be lost because he knew things about Lincoln that nobody knew. He was the only person that was with Mr. Lincoln every single day of his presidency except for being at Ford's Theater.
Hmm. Now, I know you had mentioned that historians sometimes didn't look, I guess, too fondly upon Mr. Lemon. Do you think that he's been treated fairly or unfairly?
Oh, no, he's not been treated fairly at all.
And why is that?
Historians say that he was a braggart, and you know, that may have something to do with his alcohol consumption, which was very large and probably caused his death. And they just don't give him any respect. In fact, when I was looking for a publisher of that book, the University of Illinois press said that they wouldn't publish it because one of the Lincoln historians had given them information about it. And I said, what information did they give you? And it said, they gave me the information, and it said, I don't think this book will ever be published. That was the reason why they weren't going to publish it. Which is like pretty silly, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
So I went to another route and published it differently. But he doesn't brag in his book. In his book, when he talks about the guy who snuck Lincoln through Baltimore, he said it was Lincoln's friend. He doesn't even identify himself. I have to put that in the footnote that he's talking about himself. And every time he talks about himself in the book, he doesn't identify it. So I had to tell you, so if he were bragging, he wasn't bragging in that book, and he didn't even know whether that book would ever be published. So he could have bragged, but he didn't.
Well, so he was born in what became West Virginia, and he returned to
Right.
that area, didn't he,
Right.
in the latter
Right.
part of his life? So after, what were the circumstances of him returning to that area? And
Well, he returned and set up a law practice, and he was interested in becoming governor of West Virginia. And he
was that in Martinsburg that he?
Yes, he had
established that?
law office in Martinsburg and a law office in Jaredstown, which is just south of Martinsburg and closer to where he lived. And he also ran for Congress, but was defeated. So he had lots of interest in the state when he came back to West Virginia.
And about when was that he came back?
In around 1880s, I believe, and he lived till 1893.
So he passed away in 1893, and
Right.
he's buried.
He's buried in Jaredstown, which is south of Martinsburg, and very close to Mill Creek. If you look on the map there, you won't find Mill Creek. It's called Bunker Hill today, but it's was called Mill Creek at the time.
Now, one sort of interesting thing, I guess, that you turned up in your research, his last name was spelled Lamon or A-N?
O-N.
O-N,
Right.
which you would think would be pronounced Lamon or
Right.
Lamon. But you discovered that he pronounced it Lemon. And could you tell us how you found that out?
There was a doctoral thesis done in the 1940s for the University of Illinois, and that man interviewed Lemon's daughter Dolly 12 or 13 times, and she said emphatically that it was pronounced Lemon in the East. And of course, I live in the East, and I do most of my programs in the East, so I pronounce it Lemon. And it's actually spelled 6 different ways on the family tree. Dr. Theodore in Danville had 2 brothers, and he spelled his last name Lemon, and they spelled it Lamon, so they weren't even sure in the family how to spell it, let alone pronounce it. So I think he would say, I don't care how you pronounce it, just don't call me late for dinner. You know?
Yeah. So here in our last minute of the program, do you know how he died, or what was the cause of his death, or towards the end of his life?
He had severe gout, and he had severe alcohol problems. He had ballooned up to over 300 pounds.
And he was a big man.
He was 260 as the bodyguard, and so it was complications probably from his alcoholism. He died at age 65.
And his daughter took care of him.
Right.
Towards the end of his life.
Right.
Okay. Well, Bob, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your
Thank you.
schedule and being with us all the way from Charlestown. And I'd like to thank all you folks for tuning in to History Alive.